This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the best all-in-one platform for all of your website building needs. Hey guys, it's Celestia, and recently I made the mistake of acknowledging in a video that I'm a perfectionist when it comes to my art and constantly use the undo tool to redo the same lines and brush strokes over and over again. And am also notoriously guilty of having hundreds of layers in case I don't like what I draw on one and want to delete it without affecting every layer below it. Naturally, in response, I received a multitude of requests to do the no undo challenge and the one layer challenge, because it's apparently very entertaining for you guys to watch me suffer. That's a joke, obviously, but given how ridiculously often I use the undo tool or end up with upwards of 200 layers, I am uniquely qualified to be subjected to this particular form of torture for entertainment's sake. So here I am, kind of, almost. Okay, I think there were a couple of accidental undos, and I let myself undo when I accidentally used the wrong brush, but other than that, today you're gonna see me try to finish an entire piece without undoing anything. And in terms of the one layer challenge, I tried to combine the two and do a one layer challenge with the no undo challenge, but I ended up letting myself have 3, because it was just too unbearable otherwise. There's the sketch and eventually line art layer, the flat color layer, and the rendering layer. Given that I normally have a layer for every individual part of the piece down to the ring on a character's finger, and then multiple layers for shading on each one of those, this is still a massive, massive downgrade for me. So please enjoy my suffering, it's for your benefit. But before we get into that, let me take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace, a longtime partner of this channel. Most of you already know that, in my opinion, Squarespace is the best all-in-one platform for website building and hosting out there. An opinion that I've confidently formed after years of using them to design and host both my personal Duchess Celestia portfolio website and my art studio website, long before I started working with them. Both sites were brought to life by their incredibly versatile templates, which not only streamlined the web design process, but also made it fun. Squarespace has a library of templates that accounts for just about every conceivable need, from portfolios and blogs to landing pages and online stores. And you can edit them using their Fluid Engine, a cutting-edge website design system which provides an effortless and intuitive drag-and-drop interface for customizing every facet of your site. Additionally, Squarespace simplifies print-on-demand and e-commerce integration, allowing you to effortlessly transform your site into a fully functional online store. On top of all of that, they also offer the ability to create exclusive members-only areas for premium content. So it really doesn't matter what you need your site to do. Whether you want a beautiful portfolio or a place to sell your art or build a community, you can make it on Squarespace. And you can get a free trial to test it out yourself right now by going to squarespace.com/DuchessCelestia, linked in the description, and use code DuchessCelestia for 10% off your first domain purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and please go check them out. Now let's get into the agony. Because I recently got back into We Happy Few, a game that happens to be one of my biggest special interests that I physically can't enjoy a normal, rational amount without deteriorating into hyperfixation hell, I used this challenge as an opportunity to draw fan art of Sally Boyle, one of my favorite characters from it. My wife pointed out that because she's always wearing a hat and has super short hair, you guys would probably get pissed off at me for getting out of drawing hair for this challenge, which was fair, so I drew her without it, despite how deeply iconic it is. I also just drew a bust because there's no way I'm doing more than that without undoing a single time or making more than 3 layers. I'm sorry, it's just not happening. Anyway, I don't think I've ever had more blank canvas anxiety in my life than when I was starting this piece, because this is just so far from how I normally draw. It almost felt like relinquishing control of my own art, which, as someone who is deeply obsessed with controlling every aspect of my life, I found terrifying. If I can undo every stroke, I have the power to be completely sure that every line or stylistic choice I make can be exactly how I want them to be. I don't have to worry about any mistakes being permanent, so I don't have to be anxious about the artistic process in any way. If I can keep every area separate via layers, I can render the skin without messing up the hair and so on. And if I keep every aspect of my rendering on separate layers, I can experiment with how I want it to look without worrying about not liking how it turns out, because I can just delete the layer and have the rest of the piece be completely unaffected, like a big undo. If all of my rendering is on one layer, I have to be totally confident in every stylistic choice I make, or at least totally confident in my ability to fix it by painting over it, which is horrifying. I spent like 90% of the time working on this as anxious as I'd be like interacting with another human being, which is exceptionally anxious. That's not to say this was a purely negative experience or anything, of course, because there were were a lot of positives that I'll get into more later, but it was definitely stressful and incredibly challenging, which I guess is the point of a challenge. Prior to starting, I thought I'd be most anxious about the rendering process, but as it turned out, I actually struggled the most with the sketching stage. Normally my sketches are super messy, rushed, and more just establishing the concept than actually trying to look good, because I end up going over the initial sketch with another cleaner sketch and then eventually deleting both layers once I do the line art. With this one, the sketch was going to need to be refined and turned into line art without any undone brush strokes, so I had to be a lot more careful in that process, which made it really stressful, especially as someone who normally loves the sketch process the most. I'm not gonna lie, I hated it. I tried to limit the number of times I erased anything too, because that felt too close to undoing, at least during the sketching and lining process. When it came to the rendering, I did let myself erase semi-regularly because it was still effectively punishing mistakes, since erasing on my rendering layer meant erasing all of the rendering. So like, if I messed up a line adding a highlight to something, erasing that would also mean erasing all of the shading underneath and having to paint it all over again, which deterred me from doing so for the most part and making it incredibly irritating when I did. In retrospect, it would have been better if I rendered directly on the flat color layer, but I didn't want to draw on the background, so it was more convenient to use a clipping mask. But I'm realizing now that I'm dumb and could have just used alpha lock to avoid drawing on the background, so I'm an idiot, I guess. Breaking news. Anyway, rambling, sorry. Like I was saying, the sketch process was probably what I hated most about this challenge. Less because of the technical difficulty of not undoing anything, and more because of how much anxiety it caused me to be so precise about something I'm usually not even vaguely precise about. Once the sketch was done though, I actually really enjoyed refining it and lining over it rather than doing what I normally do, which is reduce the sketch layer's opacity, make a new layer, and do the line art over it there. I'm still definitely gonna keep doing it that way in my usual work, at least for the most part, but I wouldn't be against trying this method again in some studies for fun or for experimentation's sake. Turning the sketch into more refined line art by just drawing over it and letting it be at least relatively messy as a result was actually really relaxing and fun, especially after the comparatively vastly more stressful sketching, which makes sense because, I mean, of course, defining the piece's core elements and knowing that everything you do is there forever and can't be changed is going to be a lot more anxiety-inducing than having those concepts finished and just getting to make them look better. Adding to an existing thing is a lot easier than making the thing. I guess that shouldn't be surprising. Okay, tangent, but can I just take a moment to say, I'm scripting this right after finishing drawing this, and the no undo mentality is completely stuck in my head. Like, every time I decide to reword a sentence, my brain is like, no, bad, you're cheating. And it's so funny how quickly that happened because I did not spend that much time working on this piece. More on that later. And it's actually a little alarming that it basically only took a couple hours for my brain to start accepting undo equals federal crime as a universal law. Anyway, I don't mind how the line art turned out, even though it's much messier than my normal style, in large part because I knew going into this that it would be and consciously allowed that to be the case. After adding the flat colors, next up was the part that I was dreading the most, rendering it. Like I said earlier, rendering every color and separate part of the piece on one layer without any of those aspects being themselves separate layers is not something I've ever done before in my digital work, and something that I thought I would find exceptionally challenging. But once I started, I found that a lot of my anxieties surrounding that were misplaced. It really just came down to planning the order of things. Like, okay, everything's on one layer, so if you know the hair, clothing, and eyes are all going to be on top of the skin, you can get skin colors on the hair and the clothing when you're rendering it because you know you're just going to be painting over it later when you get to that. So if you order everything right, it's really not that hard to render separate areas without messing up others even when they're all on one layer. And in some instances, the colors used in rendering one area ending up on the surrounding areas isn't a bad thing. I mean, that's what reflective light is. For example, when I airbrushed the shading on the skin and it ended up getting on the hair, I actually felt like it made it look better rather than worse, and ended up integrating that into the rendering rather than painting over it later. It gives areas that are immediately neighboring each other a similar tone, which can be beneficial rather than detrimental. I also enjoyed that when everything's on one layer, airbrushing shadow and light ensures that separate areas are still rendered evenly without having to manually apply shared light and shadow to a variety of different individual layers, ensuring shared tones and even distribution. Having everything on one layer was honestly such a time saver. It's why I said before that I didn't actually end up spending that much time on this piece, because doing it that way just saved me a ridiculous amount of time compared to my normal method. In that regard, it was amazing and actually kind of relaxing, because painting over my mistakes rather than reverting to before I made them by undoing or deleting a layer was actually less stressful than usual, rather than more stressful like I expected. I will say that it was a lot more anxiety-inducing than it would have been if I could have used the undo tool. I would definitely consider doing all of my rendering on one layer again, but only if I could undo mistakes. Rendering is something I struggle with a lot, and the convenience of doing it all at once like that is outweighed by the anxiety of knowing that every every brushstroke on that one layer had to be final, and if I airbrushed too much shadow in the wrong place or too much light in another, which I did end up doing, it would be incredibly difficult to fix, which I did not end up doing. This part came in close second to the sketch process in terms of the negative impact of not undoing on my actual enjoyment of the artistic process, and I would not do it again outside of a challenge unless it was for a study. It did make me consider my choices a lot more and was probably helpful in the long run though, and definitely worthwhile in an educational sense. If you're particularly anxious about rendering one type of thing or one type of light or shadow more so than the other, it helps you realize what aspects of rendering you're weakest at so that you can study them more in the future. The other part of the rendering process that I found particularly challenging was actually a result of it being all on one layer, and that was the lack of layer modes. I very frequently use layer modes like multiply, overlay, and screen to pick my colors when rendering, and not having that option and instead having to pick them manually, and not being able to undo it if the colors didn't work, was admittedly very difficult. It definitely made me realize how much I've come to use those layer modes as a crutch, which was eye-opening and helpful, but also mildly infuriating. I also normally put highlights on their own layers so I can use tools like bloom to make them shinier, and my shading on their own layers so I can soften them if needed with Gaussian blur. And when everything is on one layer, I can't do that, so that sucked. I think overall, in terms of that, the takeaway I've learned from this is that at least for me, I actually would benefit from potentially doing my rendering on way fewer layers and using this method again, but would absolutely make exceptions for those instances in particular so as to continue to utilize those tools. Once the rendering was done, I airbrushed some color on the line art and then flattened the main 3 layers into one. Then I blended some of the line art, painted some minor changes, and then allowed myself one more layer to add color and light alterations and then a light noise filter. It was also at this point that I realized I wanted there to be something behind Sally, even if it wasn't an actual background, and that if I were following the rules I set for myself, I should have drawn that first and drawn Sally on top of it, and that at this point I would either have to not draw it at all or draw it around her on the same layer. And I swear, if it were anything other than a circle, I would have drawn it around her and followed my rules. But Sally as a character is really into space, and a lot of her imagery in-game is very space-themed, so I really wanted there to be a planet behind her. And a planet is a circle, and oh my god, it is so hard to make a perfect or even close to perfect circle without drawing the full-ass circle, and instead just drawing it around an existing form and imagining where the invisible parts of the circle would be. It's so hard, and I knew it wouldn't look good, so I committed the unforgivable crime of breaking my rule and putting it on another layer in the background. I'm sorry. I know I've disappointed you. Please trust that I admit this to you with the same shame I felt coming clean to my mom that I stole my friend's Pokemon card when I was 6. So like, enough to know that stealing is wrong, but not enough to pretend I wouldn't go back and do it again anyway, because it was a really cute Torchic. Overall, I had a very mixed experience with this challenge. The sketch process was by far the worst, and I can say hands down that I will never do another sketch without undoing. It's just not happening. It was so stressful, and it took all the joy out of a part of the artistic process that I normally enjoy. The line art, conversely, was really helpful for me. Not having the option to undo lines I messed up forced me to learn that contrary to what my anxiety tells me, I can indeed just fix the line by going over it, rather than undoing it 100 times to try to get it perfectly right. I genuinely feel better about doing line art now. I'm still gonna undo, but I feel a lot less pressured to get the lines right the first time, something that was overwhelmingly unbearable to me before forcing myself to do this challenge, and that I'm subsequently deeply grateful to have some relief from now. In terms of rendering, not being able to undo anything did make me aware of some areas in which I didn't realize I struggled with more than others, which will help me study them to improve in the future, so it is a positive takeaway. That said, it's not something I would do again outside of studies for educational value, because it was very stressful for me and took a lot of the fun out of the whole process. Rendering all on one layer, however, was, like I said, actually not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. It's another art anxiety that I guess I didn't realize I needed to confront. I was so sure that keeping every aspect of the piece on its own layer for rendering was the only way to avoid messing up other areas that I didn't realize how time-saving and generally beneficial it could be if I just changed my approach to it. And I think I'm gonna start doing it a lot more in my regular work now, honestly. Maybe not all on one layer, and definitely with the aforementioned exceptions for things I want to use tools on, like bloom and Gaussian blur, but vastly fewer than before. I also feel way less stressed about the idea of rendering one area resulting in those colors affecting others, now that I've seen how easily fixed of a problem that is, and how beneficial it can actually be in some circumstances. I don't love the finished piece, and it could absolutely be better, but number 1, it's Sally, and I love her. Number 2, it's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. And 3, I feel like I learned a lot from making it. I really thought I'd be ending this video by saying, I hope you enjoyed my suffering that you requested after doing this challenge, but I had a much better time doing it than I thought I would. Sorry, sadists. I would absolutely recommend doing either of these these challenges. If not for fun, then at least to learn about yourself as an artist and potentially confront some anxieties that you might not realize you had about the artistic process. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you did and would want to see more art challenges in the future like this and the Same Piece in 7 Styles series, because I've been enjoying these a lot more than I expected to, and if you guys like them too, I'm happy to keep going. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak 42, King Good James, Art of Amethyst Fable, Scourge the Cat 67, and Haruki Kenway, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Langshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gentong, Grayson Xavier, MG, Law Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Captain Reku, Ryan M. Williams, Cat Bus, Alec Reinekainen, Mac, and Lucy Amajiki, and I'll see you in the next one.